Alarms crackled through a city of illusion. Frantic shouts cut through the night air, mixing with the acrid smell of smoke and burning celluloid. This was the night the Backlot burned, a fire that devoured not just movie sets, but also secrets, fortunes, and golden reputations. This is the story of the Backlot fire conspiracy, a tale that pulls back the velvet curtain on Gilded Age ambition and dangerous royal intrigue. By the end, you will understand how a single blaze could connect a desperate prince, a fabulously wealthy heiress, and the ruthless world of early Hollywood. What was really lost in those flames beyond the painted facades, and whose fortunes were saved by the ash? What do you believe is the true price of a gilded legacy? That desperate prince we mentioned was just one player in a much larger social upheaval. While Europe's old aristocratic families clung to their titles and crumbling castles, a new kind of power was rising across the Atlantic. This was the Gilded Age, an era of breathtaking industrial expansion in America. Men with names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Carnegie amassed fortunes so vast they rivaled the treasuries of entire nations. Their wealth was new, raw, and for the established nobility of Europe, deeply unfashionable. But these American titans had a problem. Money could buy palaces and art collections, but it could not buy the one thing European society valued most: a hereditary title. This created a perfect, if cynical, exchange. On one side of the ocean, you had British dukes and French princes who owned immense ancestral estates, but were secretly drowning in debt. On the other side, you had American heiresses whose fathers could easily settle those debts, but who lacked the social prestige of a noble lineage. So a new transatlantic trade began, not in goods, but in titles and dowries. It was nicknamed the invasion of the dollar princesses. These young women were sent to Europe with fortunes in their hope chests, their marriages brokered like business mergers. In exchange for replenishing a noble family's coffers, they received a coronet and the right to be called lady or duchess. This exchange created a new class of power players, individuals who moved between the old world and the new, their influence spanning continents. They were footnotes in the society pages, but their wealth and connections would soon set the stage for a scandal that would shake both worlds to their core. Amidst this transatlantic exchange of titles for cash, a very different kind of illusion was being perfected in California. The movie studio Backlot was a world unto itself, a sprawling and chaotic kingdom of make-believe. On any given day, you could walk from a dusty Western street straight into a Parisian boulevard, then turn a corner and find yourself in a medieval castle courtyard. These entire cities were built not from stone and steel, but from wood, plaster, and a great deal of wishful thinking. Facades were just that, fronts held up by wooden braces, convincing only from the precise angle the camera would see. This was the dream factory in its most literal form, a place where reality was entirely optional. The value contained within its fences was almost unimaginable. It was not just the standing sets that represented a fortune in labor and materials. Warehouses were crammed with priceless artifacts, custom-made costumes for historical epics, one-of-a-kind props, and the fragile, flammable reels of film that were the industry's lifeblood. This was the physical heart of Hollywood's magic, and its destruction would be a catastrophe far beyond the loss of scenery. It was a vault of cultural treasures, all terrifyingly vulnerable. The first wisp of smoke was spotted just after midnight, a pale gray ghost against a starless sky. The air that night was unusually still and dry, a perfect canvas for disaster. A night watchman patrolling near the western street first caught the scent, something sharper than the usual smells of fresh paint and sawdust. Within minutes, that wisp became a plume, and the plume erupted into a roaring inferno that raced through the Backlot's wooden canyons with terrifying speed. The initial alarm was met with disbelief, then frantic action. Studio firefighters, trained for small, contained blazes, were quickly overwhelmed. Employees who lived on the lot rushed from their bungalows, joining a desperate, disorganized effort to save whatever they could. The fire was an indiscriminate monster. It feasted on the European castle facade, its cardboard turrets and painted stonework vanishing in a shower of embers. It raced down a meticulously crafted New York street, reducing brownstones and storefronts to a skeleton of blackened timber. A grand ballroom set, built for a society drama and adorned with real crystal chandeliers and silk draperies, became a brilliant, short-lived bonfire. The heat was so intense, it melted the glass in nearby warehouse windows, while the wind carried burning scraps of film stock through the air like a storm of deadly, flickering fireflies. In those chaotic hours, the Dream Factory was not just damaged. It was being systematically erased. The official explanation arrived with the morning papers, a story of faulty wiring and tragic, random chance. A spark from an overloaded circuit, a carelessly dropped match, anything could have ignited the tinder dry sets. It was a simple, heartbreaking accident, a risk inherent in the Dream Factory's flammable nature. This narrative was clean, understandable, and it allowed a grieving industry to begin picking up the pieces. But almost immediately, a counter-narrative began to smolder in the minds of those who had witnessed the blaze firsthand. Insurance adjusters, trained to see past the ashes to a fire's origin story, were among the first to voice quiet concerns. They noted how the flames seemed to have multiple points of ignition, spreading through the lot not like a single growing wave, but like a coordinated attack. Veteran journalists, their instincts honed on City Hall corruption and gangland killings, found the official story too neat, too convenient. Why did the fire move with such ferocious, intelligent speed, leaping across fire breaks to target the most valuable, historically significant sets? A carelessly discarded cigarette might explain a single burning facade, but not the systematic destruction of an entire Backlot kingdom. These whispers of doubt were the first embers of a much larger conspiracy, a question that would not be extinguished. Was this truly a disaster born of misfortune, or was it a meticulously planned demolition? Into this volatile mix of fire and suspicion stepped a woman whose name was synonymous with Gilded Age wealth, Eleanor Standish. Eleanor was a dollar princess in the truest sense, the daughter of a railroad magnate who had traded a staggering dowry for a now distant European title. Widowed and fiercely independent, she had taken control of her vast inheritance and, in a move that shocked her social circle, invested a substantial portion of it in the burgeoning film industry. She was not a flamboyant starlet seeking the spotlight, but a silent partner in the very studio whose backlot now lay in ashes. Her investment was a calculated risk, a belief that the new art of cinema was the next great frontier of American influence. Through a complex web of holding companies and her late husband's remaining business interests, Aliner's fortune was deeply entangled with the studio's physical assets. The grand castle facade that burned was not just a set to her, it was part of her financial portfolio. The custom-built costumes and rare props represented a tangible piece of her security. For Aliner, the fire was not merely a cultural tragedy. It was a direct and devastating assault on her personal fortune. Her financial vulnerability in the aftermath was immediate and severe. The whispers of conspiracy now had a face, and it was the face of a powerful woman who had everything to lose. If the fire was indeed deliberate, who stood to gain from her ruin? Aliner Standish's financial entanglement with the studio leads us directly to a single, pivotal document, the insurance policy. The policy covering the Backlot's contents was not a standard formality. It was a behemoth. The declared value was a sum so immense it could have funded the construction of a small city, a figure that stunned even seasoned industry financiers. This was not merely insurance for the physical structures, the wood and plaster facades, but for the irreplaceable artifacts housed within them. The policy itemized everything, from the custom silk gowns worn by leading ladies to the hand-carved furniture from period dramas, and most critically, the vast film library stored in specially built vaults. Each piece was assigned a valuation that seemed to anticipate not just its cost, but its future cultural worth. The timing of this policy's inception is where the financial motive begins to crystallize. The massive coverage was secured a mere 3 months before the fire, a period of quiet stability for the studio, a time when no rational assessment would have predicted such a catastrophic loss. This was not a renewal, but a new, aggressive expansion of coverage that dramatically outpaced the studio's growth. Furthermore, the policy contained clauses so unusual they raised eyebrows among the few who saw them. One clause specifically waived standard investigations for fires deemed of unknown origin if they occurred during a period of civil unrest, a term loosely defined enough to encompass almost any public disturbance. Another clause expedited payment for losses of historic and cultural properties, bypassing the lengthy appraisal process that typically followed a major disaster. Why would a studio secure such a generous, almost eager payout structure just weeks before its most valuable assets were reduced to ash? The existence of this policy does not just suggest a motive. It paints a picture of a plan, a financial trapdoor waiting to be opened by a carefully set match. Just days after the embers cooled, the studio needed a culprit, and they found one in a man named Leo Walsh. Leo was a studio carpenter, a quiet man known for his skill with ornate moldings and his simmering resentment over recent pay cuts. The official story, fed to hungry reporters, was a masterpiece of convenient simplicity. An anonymous tip claimed Leo had been heard muttering threats in the studio commissary. A misplaced wrench was discovered near the origin point of the fire. A tool foreman swore belonged to his kit. It was a narrative that made a bleak kind of sense. A disgruntled worker seeking a petty revenge that spiraled into an uncontrollable catastrophe. The public, eager for a resolution, largely accepted it. Headlines blared the story of the lone wolf arsonist, a man who had single-handedly destroyed a piece of American dreams. The studio executives expressed public sorrow and private relief, appearing to cooperate fully with an investigation that was now neatly contained. They painted a picture of Leo as an unstable element, a rogue spark in an otherwise well-oiled machine. But the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial. The anonymous tip was never verified. The wrench could have been planted, and Leo himself had a solid alibi for the early part of that evening, having been seen miles away at a public diner. The case against him was not built on proof, but on the powerful need for a quick and tidy conclusion. Why was the studio so eager to pin this disaster on one man and close the book? The rush to blame Leo Walsh felt less like justice and more like a deliberate effort to smother the truth under a blanket of convenient blame. The man at the center of this financial web was Aliner's husband, Prince Albrecht von Hessenberg. On the surface, he was the picture of European nobility, a man with a lineage that traced back centuries in a castle filled with ancestral portraits. But behind the gilded facade, his world was crumbling. The prince was a man haunted by debt, a chain of obligations forged in the exclusive gambling clubs of Monte Carlo, and a series of disastrous investments in German industrial stocks that had collapsed. His title granted him immense social credit, but the actual funds to support his lifestyle had long since evaporated. Creditors were no longer sending polite letters. They were sending legal summonses. The prince's financial desperation created a silent, mounting pressure on Aliner's American fortune. He viewed her wealth not as a separate entity, but as a natural extension of his own patrimony, a resource to be tapped to save his family's legacy from humiliating bankruptcy. This meant that the fate of his entire noble house was now indirectly tied to the financial health of a Hollywood film studio. If Aliner's investment there failed, his primary source of emergency funds would vanish. The prince needed a swift and massive infusion of cash, the kind of sum that only a catastrophic insurance payout could provide. His quiet desperation transforms the narrative from a simple case of fraud into a high-stakes royal drama. Was a prince willing to sacrifice his wife's American assets to save his own European birthright? The official story of a lone, disgruntled carpenter began to fray at the edges almost immediately. While the studio and the press were content with the simple narrative, one man was not. His name was Frank Parrish, a veteran fire marshal with 2 decades of experience reading the brutal language of burned things. To him, a fire told a story, and the story this one was whispering did not match the public tale. He started with the origin point, or what should have been a single point. His initial walk through the smoldering wreckage revealed a pattern that made his blood run cold. There was not one heart to the Inferno, but 3. One near the European castle set, another deep within the New York street warehouse, and a third at the far end of the western town. These locations were separated by wide fire breaks, stretches of paved road designed to stop a blaze in its tracks. For a single, accidental fire to have started and jumped, these barriers defied all logic. It pointed to a coordinated effort, a planned ignition. Then came the lab reports. Buried in the technical analysis of debris samples were traces of a chemical compound not native to any movie set, a common industrial accelerant used to ensure a fire burned hot, fast, and completely. This was not the residue of burning film or painted wood. This was the ghost of a tool, a deliberate catalyst for chaos. The final and perhaps most damning piece came from a witness everyone else had overlooked. A night janitor, taking a break behind a soundstage far from the main chaos, reported seeing two figures, not one, moving quickly away from the backlot just before the first alarm sounded. He described them as moving with purpose, not panic, and noted they carried what looked like metal cans. Frank Parrish now had a trifecta of proof that pointed away from an accident and toward a deliberate, professional act of destruction. The question was no longer how the fire started, but who had the resources and the cold nerve to orchestrate such a devastating crime. While Frank Parrish pieced together his quiet investigation, a very public storm was brewing. The tabloid press, led by media titans like William Randolph Hearst, smelled a story far richer than a simple studio fire. This was a narrative dripping with the ingredients they craved: old world royalty, new world money, and the tantalizing whiff of a massive crime. Headlines did not just report the facts. They constructed a dazzling, scandalous fantasy. The Daily Mirror might scream, "Did a prince order the torching of Tinseltown?" While another would feature a grainy photo of Elinor Standish with the caption, "The Heiress and the Ashes." Was her fortune saved or sacrificed? The press masterfully wove together the threads of the story, presenting the prince's debts, Elinor's investment, and the colossal insurance policy as a single, sinister tapestry. They painted the prince as a desperate European aristocrat, willing to burn down his wife's American playground to salvage his ancient castle. Elinor was cast in a dual role, sometimes the tragic victim of a ruthless husband, other times the cunning accomplice, using her fortune to manipulate events from the shadows. The public could not get enough. These stories sold millions of newspapers because they tapped into a deep cultural anxiety. The fear that the glamorous world of the elite was just a facade, and that behind the velvet ropes lay corruption and deceit. This media frenzy did more than just entertain. It put immense pressure on the official investigation and turned a complex financial mystery into a sensational public trial. The truth was becoming buried under an avalanche of ink and speculation, making the search for what really happened that night more difficult and more dangerous than ever before. On the night the backlot burned, Elinor Standish was the picture of Gilded Age elegance, seated in a plush velvet box at the opera. Witnesses from the highest echelons of society would later attest to her presence, noting she seemed entirely engrossed in the tragic romance unfolding on stage. Her gloved hands applauded at all the right moments. She was seen during the intermission, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries about the soprano's performance. It was a flawless, unshakable alibi, a performance in its own right staged before an audience of the most credible people in the city. But was this a simple matter of being in the right place at the right time, or was it something far more calculated? A night at the opera is not just a social engagement. It is a public declaration of one's presence. Every glance, every conversation becomes a verifiable fact. For someone who needed to be seen far from the flames, there could be no better stage. The very perfection of her alibi invites a deeper question. Could the chaos of a fire be orchestrated from a distance, while the mastermind remains visibly, impeccably detached from the crime scene? This creates a troubling duality. Either Elinor Standish was an innocent woman enjoying a night of culture, tragically unaware that her fortune was turning to ash miles away, or she was a brilliant strategist using the spotlight of high society to craft an ironclad defense before a single accusation was even uttered. The truth of her innocence may hinge not on what she did that night, but on why she made sure so many people saw her doing it. While Elinor Standish was performing her part at the opera, her husband, Prince Albrecht, was moving through a world of shadows. His evening was a stark contrast to her well-documented public appearance. There were no society columnists to note his presence, no fellow aristocrats to vouch for his conversation. The prince's official statement claimed he had spent the evening at his private club, a bastion of old-world discretion where men of his station were seldom questioned. But the club's own staff, when quietly interviewed, provided only vague and contradictory accounts. One porter recalled seeing the prince arrive, but another was certain he had not signed the guest ledger. The prince's own chauffeur offered a timeline of the evening that seemed curiously elastic, full of unexplained gaps and long, unattended waits in the car. During the precise hours the fire raged through the backlot, Prince Albrecht was effectively a ghost. This lack of a verifiable alibi opens a door to far darker possibilities. Was he meeting with the kind of men who operate outside the glare of society? Individuals who could arrange for a catastrophic fire with clinical precision. His desperate financial situation provided a powerful motive, and his unaccounted for hours provided the opportunity. The prince's shadowy evening does not prove his guilt, but it weaves a thread of deep suspicion directly to him, suggesting that while his wife was securing her public innocence, he may have been orchestrating their private salvation by any means necessary. Hollywood was not a single dream factory, but a collection of warring kingdoms. While one studio celebrated a hit, its rivals plotted its next downfall. In this cutthroat environment, the destruction of a competitor's primary backlot was not just a tragedy, it was a strategic opportunity. The studio that burned was on a meteoric rise, its slate of historical epics and sophisticated dramas capturing the public's imagination, and most importantly, a dominant share of the box office. Their success came directly at the expense of older, more established studios, who watched their own influence and profits dwindle. The tension was palpable, a Cold War fought in trade papers and at exclusive parties. The fire, therefore, did not happen in a vacuum. It occurred at the precise moment when one studio's creative and financial ascendancy threatened to permanently reshape the entire industry. The question becomes unavoidable: who benefits from such a catastrophic setback? The answer points directly to the rival studios who stood to regain their lost territory. The financial evidence in the aftermath is startlingly clear. One competitor in particular, Monarch Pictures, saw its stock value surge by nearly 40% in the weeks following the fire. This was not a slow, organic recovery, but a dramatic spike that coincided exactly with their rival's paralysis. Furthermore, Monarch quickly announced an aggressive expansion of its own production schedule, greenlighting projects that eerily mirrored the very films that had been lost in the blaze, as if they had pre-prepared scripts just waiting for their moment. They even began hiring away key directors and costume designers from the fire-ravaged studio, offering contracts that seemed to anticipate a sudden availability of top talent. This was not merely taking advantage of a competitor's misfortune. It was a perfectly executed corporate maneuver that required prior knowledge and preparation. Could a rival studio have seen arson not as a crime, but as the ultimate business strategy, a way to eliminate a threat and capture its market share in one devastating, deniable strike? The fire may have burned down one kingdom, but it certainly cleared the way for another to rise. The bitter labor disputes tearing through the studio were a war fought in the open. While executives and starlets moved through a world of glamour, the carpenters, painters, and electricians who built that world were locked in a brutal struggle for basic rights. Their demands were simple: a living wage, reasonable working hours, and safe conditions on sets notoriously riddled with hazards. The studio's ownership refused every single one. They saw the unions not as partners, but as a direct threat to their control and their profits. This standoff created a pressure cooker of resentment, a volatile atmosphere where the idea of sabotage could shift from an unthinkable crime to a desperate weapon. Could a fire, a catastrophe that would cost the studio millions, be seen by some as the only language management would understand? The question shifts the conspiracy away from high finance and toward the raw human anger simmering just below the studio's glittering surface. This was not about insurance payouts or royal titles. It was about power. The studio's refusal to negotiate had backed its workforce into a corner, and a cornered animal is capable of anything. The fire, in this light, becomes a monstrous act of protest, a message written in flame, but who would be bold enough or angry enough to light the match? The investigation into this angle reveals a fractured labor movement. The mainstream union leaders publicly condemned the fire, recognizing it would destroy public sympathy and cripple their cause. But within the ranks, there were whispers of more radical factions, men who believed peaceful strikes were futile against such a powerful adversary. These extremists argued that only a direct, catastrophic blow to the studio's physical assets could force the owners to the bargaining table. The fire's precise targeting of the most expensive and difficult to replace sets in warehouses suggests an intimate knowledge of the studio's operations, the kind of knowledge only an insider would possess. It points to someone who knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum financial and operational pain. This theory transforms the backlot from a crime scene into a battlefield, where the flames were not just destroying property, but delivering a terrifying ultimatum. Was this the tragic, violent escalation of a class war, where the dream factory itself became the price of defiance? Amidst the smoldering ruins lay the total loss of a film called The Crimson Crown, the studio's most ambitious and costly production to date. This was not merely a movie. It was a cultural event in waiting, a sweeping historical epic that had consumed 2 years of meticulous planning and a budget so vast it dwarfed the annual revenues of some small countries. The Crimson Crown was the studio's great hope, the project designed to elevate it from a successful company to an immortal legend in the annals of cinema. Its destruction was a wound that went far beyond the financial ledger. The film promised a visual spectacle never before seen, with painstakingly accurate recreations of Versailles and costumes woven with real gold thread. Its cast was a constellation of the era's brightest stars, and its director was a visionary known for his uncompromising artistic standards. For months, the public had been fed tantalizing details through carefully placed magazine articles, building an anticipation that felt like a national fever. The loss of the Crimson Crown meant the silencing of a story, the erasure of a performance, the end of a cultural conversation before it could even begin. Financially, the blow was catastrophic. The studio had leveraged its future on this single production, taking out enormous loans against its projected box office triumph. Without the film to release, there would be no revenue to repay those debts, no profits to fund the next slate of pictures, no dividends for investors like Alina Standish. The fire did not just burn sets, it incinerated a future. How do you measure the true cost of a lost dream? It is a price counted not just in dollars and cents, but in the collective imagination of a generation, a masterpiece that the world would now never see. Every grand conspiracy needs a weak link in its chain of loyalty. In the months following the fire, as theories swirled and investigations stalled, the entire case hinged on a single, terrified individual, a woman named Clara Bell. Clara was not a star or an executive. She was Alina Standish's personal secretary, a figure of quiet efficiency who moved through the world of the elite as a silent witness. She had been with Alina for over a decade, managing her correspondence, her social calendar, and the most intimate details of her financial life. Clara was the keeper of the keys, the one person who saw the unvarnished truth behind the gilded facade. Her loyalty to the heiress was absolute, forged in years of trusted service. But that loyalty was about to fracture under the immense weight of a guilty conscience. The pressure began to show in small, almost imperceptible ways. She became jumpy, misplacing documents she had always kept in perfect order. Colleagues noticed dark circles under her eyes, the telltale signs of sleepless nights. She was carrying a secret, a piece of information so damning it threatened to consume her. The breaking point came during a routine meeting with the studio's lawyers. They were discussing the insurance claim, speaking in cold, clinical terms about valuations and payout schedules. One of the lawyers made an offhand comment about the fortunate timing of the policy's renewal. For Clara, that single word, fortunate, was a spark on tinder. It forced her to recall a memory she had tried to bury, a conversation she had overheard between Alina and the prince just weeks before the fire. She had been in the adjoining study, arranging flowers, the door left slightly ajar. Their voices were low, but the tension in them was sharp and clear. The prince was speaking about liquidity, about a deadline that could not be extended. Then Alina's voice, cool and resolute, cut through. She said, "The asset must be liquidated before the quarter's end." There are no other options. At the time, Clara assumed they were discussing a stock portfolio or a real estate holding. But after the fire, the word liquidated took on a horrifying new meaning. She realized with sickening clarity that she had not been listening to a financial discussion, but to the planning of a crime. Her conscience would no longer allow her to be a silent accomplice. The question was, did she have the courage to become a whistleblower and shatter the world of the very woman she had devoted her life to serving? Clara Bell's knowledge was a weapon, and the powerful moved quickly to disarm her. The machinery of the cover-up began with quiet, deliberate force, not in public courtrooms, but in private drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. Elinor Standish's fortune was not just money in a bank. It was a tool of immense social leverage. A discreet donation to a police commissioner's favorite charity could ensure certain lines of inquiry were deprioritized. An invitation to a lavish weekend at a country estate for a key judge could result in procedural delays that stretched into oblivion. The prince's title, though financially hollow, still commanded a deep, almost reflexive respect. A word from him to an old school friend in the Foreign Service could derail an investigator's promotion. A suggestion made over brandy and cigars could imply that pursuing certain angles was not in the national interest, that it risked a diplomatic incident with a European ally. This was not about issuing blatant threats. It was about applying the gentle, suffocating pressure of social obligation and unspoken consequence. Witnesses who saw too much found their memories growing curiously fuzzy. A janitor who reported two figures with metal cans was suddenly offered a lucrative job overseas, with a signing bonus that eased his conscience. A fire marshal like Frank Parrish, who insisted on the evidence of accelerants, found his budget for lab work mysteriously slashed, and his superiors reassigning him to minor cases. The message was clear and chilling. Cooperation brought rewards, while obstinance brought professional ruin. This was how justice was obstructed not with a bang, but with a whisper, the silent, systemic power of wealth and status, ensuring that some truths remained buried under layers of influence and ash. The official story of the Backlot fire was a masterpiece of isolated tragedy, but the truth has a way of repeating itself. Buried deep in the studio's own safety records was the ghost of another fire, a smaller, quieter blaze that had occurred just over a year before the main catastrophe. This earlier incident was dismissed as a minor electrical fault in a costume warehouse, a small, contained loss that barely warranted a footnote in the studio's history. It was quickly forgotten by everyone except the insurance adjusters, who quietly paid the claim, and the few employees who remembered the strange details. The fire had broken out in a single, remote building housing thousands of custom-made costumes. The official cause was a frayed wire, but the building's electrician had sworn the wiring in that section had been upgraded only months before. More curiously, the fire seemed to have consumed its fuel with an unusual intensity, leaving behind a peculiar chemical odor that the initial report vaguely attributed to burning synthetic fabrics. The payout was modest, a fraction of the later claim, but it followed the same peculiar protocol, bypassing lengthy appraisal due to the unique and historic nature of the lost costumes. This was not a random accident. It was a test run. The first fire was a rehearsal, a chance for the conspirators to probe the studio's security, to understand the response time of its private fire crew, and most importantly, to test the insurance company's willingness to pay without a deep investigation. The success of that small, efficient blaze would have given them confidence, proving their method was sound and their escape clean. The pattern is chillingly clear, a perpetrator growing bolder, moving from a controlled, single-building burn to the orchestrated annihilation of an entire backlot. What began as a quiet experiment in arson ended in a roaring, spectacular inferno. The insurance payout arrived with the quiet efficiency of a bank transfer, a river of cash flowing into the studio's scorched accounts. Reconstruction began almost immediately, the sounds of hammers and saws replacing the crackle of flames. New facades, sturdier and more fire-resistant, rose from the ashes. But the money could not wash away the smell of smoke or the stain of suspicion. Every new board of lumber, every fresh coat of paint, felt like an attempt to bury the truth under a veneer of progress. The studio was physically healing, but its reputation was forever scarred. Whispers followed the executives at every industry party, and the public, while eager for new films, now watched them with a cynical eye, wondering what secrets lay behind the glittering images. For Elinor Standish and Prince Albrecht, the financial salvation was a hollow victory. Their names, once synonymous with untouchable privilege, were now dragged through the mud of tabloid speculation. Invitations to the most exclusive galas grew scarce. The subtle coldness they encountered in drawing rooms and at charity balls was a punishment more precise than any courtroom verdict. They were pariahs in the world they had once ruled, their gilded cage now a prison of sidelong glances and hushed conversations that ceased the moment they entered a room. The strain of maintaining a united public front began to fracture their private life. The prince retreated into a bitter silence, brooding over the salvation of his castle that had cost him his social honor. Elinor, who had navigated the worlds of finance and society with equal grace, found herself isolated, shouldering the dual burdens of public disgrace in a crumbling marriage. The very conspiracy that may have been designed to save them was now systematically destroying everything else they valued, turning their alliance into a tense, silent war fought behind closed doors. Their legacy was no longer one of grandeur, but of a ruinous secret that threatened to consume them both. Decades later, the case file was dusted off, no longer a matter of whispers, but of science. Modern forensic historians, armed with tools the original investigators could not have dreamed of, have begun sifting through the archived evidence. They started with the original debris samples, preserved in a forgotten police warehouse. Using gas chromatography mass spectrometry, a technique that identifies chemical compounds with pinpoint accuracy, they confirmed Fire Marshal Parrish's long-ignored suspicions. The samples contained traces of a specific hydrocarbon cocktail, a commercial accelerant commonly used in the 1920s for industrial cleaning. This was not a residue that could be explained by burning film stock or painted lumber. It was the chemical fingerprint of arson, clear and undeniable. Then came the digital reconstruction. By scanning thousands of archived crime scene photographs and witness statements into a sophisticated computer model, analysts could simulate the fire's spread. The model consistently showed that the blaze could not have achieved its documented speed and ferocity without multiple, simultaneous points of ignition. The fire breaks should have contained a single accidental fire, but in every simulation, the digital flames leaped these barriers with an intelligence that pointed to a coordinated attack. The old janitor's testimony about two men with metal cans, once dismissed as unreliable, now aligned perfectly with the scientific data. The question is no longer if the fire was set, but why the truth was so effectively buried for so long. The official case was closed, the insurance money paid, and the ruins rebuilt. Yet the question of justice remained a gaping, unanswered hole. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, the compelling motives, and the quiet findings of investigators like Frank Parrish, not a single person was ever formally charged with the crime of arson. This legal silence is, in many ways, the conspiracy's most telling feature. Why did the justice system, so eager to blame a lone carpenter, fail to follow the evidence to its logical, powerful conclusion? One prevailing theory suggests the cover-up was simply too perfect, its architects too insulated by their social and financial armor. The web of influence was not a single thread to be pulled, but a fortress. When a potential witness like Clara Bell was neutralized with a generous payoff or a veiled threat, and when a determined fire marshal found his career stalled, it sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider speaking up. The system was not just corrupted in one place. It was compromised at every possible point of entry, from the police precinct to the courthouse. Pursuing a case against figures of such immense standing required a level of institutional courage that simply did not exist. The cost of prosecuting a prince and a Gilded Age heiress was deemed too high, the potential for political and social fallout too great. Another, more haunting theory proposes that the truth itself was the problem. The full story, if it had ever been presented in a court of law, would have been too explosive for the era to handle. It would have laid bare the brutal financial realities behind noble titles, revealing the aristocracy as a hollow shell propped up by American cash. It would have exposed the cutthroat corruption of the young film industry, showing that the dream factory was willing to burn its own dreams for profit. And it would have shattered the public's carefully constructed image of the elite, proving that behind the mansions and the opera boxes lay a moral vacuum. Perhaps the authorities decided that some illusions were necessary for the social order to hold. A quiet, unsolved mystery was preferable to a public trial that would have torn down the very foundations of power and privilege. In the end, the lack of a conviction became its own form of verdict, a silent admission that in a world of gilded lies, the truth is often the one thing that cannot be allowed to see the light of day. The fire's legacy was etched not only in ash, but in the very DNA of Hollywood itself. In the immediate aftermath, the industry could no longer ignore its profound vulnerability. The era of haphazard construction and tinder dry backlots was forcibly brought to an end. New, stringent safety codes were implemented across every major studio, mandating fireproof materials for new sets, the installation of advanced sprinkler systems that could drench an entire street in seconds, and strict protocols for storing flammable film stock in fortified, isolated vaults. The Dream Factory was forced to build its illusions on a foundation of concrete and steel, trading some of its reckless charm for a new, non-negotiable responsibility. The financial shockwaves were just as transformative. The colossal insurance payout and the suspicions that swirled around it fundamentally altered how studios valued and insured their assets. Gone were the days of loosely defined policies. In their place arose complex, meticulously itemized contracts that treated a custom-built costume or a one-of-a-kind prop with the same gravitas as a piece of real estate. Insurance companies dispatched their own inspectors to patrol the lots, their eyes constantly searching for the slightest risk. The fire taught the money men a brutal lesson, that the most valuable property in Hollywood was not land, but imagination, and that it needed to be protected from both accident and avarice. Perhaps the most enduring change, however, was not in building codes or balance sheets, but in public relations. The Backlot fire and its subsequent cover-up became the blueprint for how modern celebrity scandals are managed. The playbook was written right there in the 1920s, a masterclass in narrative control. First, you provide a simple, sympathetic culprit, the disgruntled employee. Then you use social and financial influence to quietly neutralize inconvenient witnesses and stubborn investigators. Finally, you rebuild so quickly and so publicly that the new story of recovery overwrites the old one of destruction. This template of distraction, deflection, and dignified silence is now the standard operating procedure for any crisis involving the powerful, a dark art perfected in the smoke of a Hollywood fire. The conspiracy did more than just burn down sets. It taught the elite how to shape a story, ensuring that the final cut would always be theirs. The Backlot fire was far more than a simple act of arson. It was a perfect storm, a violent collision of three distinct worlds hurtling toward each other with an almost mathematical inevitability. First, you had the Gilded Age heiress, Eleanor Standish, a product of the Dollar Princess era who sought to translate her new wealth into lasting cultural power through the modern art of cinema. Her investment in the studio was not a hobby. It was a strategic move to secure a legacy beyond her husband's fading title. Then you have the European royalty, Prince Albrecht, representing an ancient system of inherited prestige that was buckling under the weight of its own financial decay. His desperation was not just personal. It was systemic, a last frantic attempt to save a lineage from the humiliation of bankruptcy. And finally, you have the ruthless, nascent empire of Hollywood itself, a place where fortunes were made and broken overnight, where rival studios operated like warring city-states, and where the line between ambition and criminality was often blurred beyond recognition. Each of these forces operated under its own relentless pressure. Eleanor needed her investment to succeed, to cement her independence. The prince needed a massive, immediate cash infusion to preserve his birthright. And the competitive studio needed its rising rival eliminated. The Backlot, with its colossal insurance policy and its terrifying vulnerability, became the one place where all three of these pressures could be catastrophically released. It was the fuse that connected three separate powder kegs. Think of it this way: the prince provided the motive, a desperate need for capital. The heiress's investment provided the target, an asset so overinsured its destruction was more valuable than its success. And the corrupt, competitive nature of early Hollywood provided both the method and the means, a shadowy network where such a crime could be planned and executed with professional precision. The fire was not the work of a single villain, but the logical outcome of a dangerous convergence. It was the point where old world desperation met new world ambition, and the Dream Factory became the unwitting stage for a real-life drama of betrayal and survival. The flames did not just consume wood and plaster. They consumed the very illusions that held these three worlds together, leaving behind a truth far more complex and chilling than any fictional story the studio could have ever produced. The evidence for a conspiracy is a tapestry woven from too many threads to ignore. We have a prince on the verge of financial collapse, an heiress whose fortune was tied to a dangerously overinsured asset, and a rival studio that profited spectacularly from the chaos. We have a fire that behaved not like an accident, but like a coordinated attack, with multiple points of ignition and traces of industrial accelerant. We have a perfect alibi performed at the opera in a shadowy evening with no alibi at all. We have a rushed effort to blame a lone carpenter and a systematic campaign to silence every witness and investigator who asked the wrong questions. Each piece alone might be coincidence, but together, they form a picture of a crime executed with chilling precision and buried under layers of wealth and influence. So we are left with a single, haunting question that echoes across the decades. Was the Backlot fire a tragic accident of fate, or was it one of Hollywood's first and most successful covered-up crimes, a perfect sin where the rich and powerful not only got away with it, but built a new empire on the ashes? The official record says one thing, but the whispers of history suggest something far darker. What do you believe happened on that smoky, starless night? Share your own theories in the comments below.